You're listening to the story. A cowboy took in a rain-soaked woman aware she was hunted by her powerful father. The wind howled across the Montana plains like a restless beast, rattling the wooden walls of a lonely cabin. Inside, Garrett Weston sat by a dim lantern, mending a bridle in silence. For 7 years, silence had been his only companion. But on this storm-torn night, everything changed. A frantic knock at the door. A desperate voice crying out, "Please, shelter! I'm lost. Duh." When he opened the door, she stood there soaked, to the bone, trembling, her eyes holding secrets she could not yet speak. What Garrett didn't know was that this woman wasn't just a lost traveler. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the West, and her father would stop at nothing to bring her home. The wind screamed across the Montana plains like a wounded beast, clawing at the walls of Garrett Weston's solitary cabin. It had howled for 3 days straight, dragging sheets of rain in its teeth, testing the strength of every weathered log and loose shingle. Late October had arrived with the taste of early winter, and the land braced itself for the coming snow. Garrett moved through his small cabin with the economy of a man who had long grown used to silence. His boots creaked against the rough-hewn floorboards as he stirred the meager fire. Outside, the storm's fury rattled the window frames like skeletal fingers tapping insistently. 7 years he had lived out here, ever since Martha and Samuel, his wife and newborn son, had been swallowed by a harsh winter fever. He had buried them himself under the frozen earth, marking their graves with 2 small wooden crosses on the hill behind the cabin. Since then, the land had been his only companion. Endless chores, chopping wood, mending fences, tending catala, his mind busy but never silent. He'd grown lean, his face chiseled by wind and sun, his eyes the color of storm clouds themselves gray. Watchful, weary. On the 3rd night of the storm, with rain lashing against the walls like 1,000 fists, Garrett sat at his table, carefully mending a worn leather bridle by lantern light. The warm glow painted the cabin in golden hues, but beyond the window, only blackness and chaos reigned. Then it came the sound that didn't belong. A knock. Garrett froze. The leather strap slipped from his calloused fingers. Another knock, louder. This time, hurried, almost panicked. His hand went instinctively to the hunting knife at his belt. Visitors were rare out here. A visitor in a storm, unheard of. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rusty from disuse. A faint reply struggled against the howling wind. "Please. Shelter. I'm lost." It was a woman's voice, fragile, desperate. Garrett hesitated. His caution screamed at him. Trouble often came dressed as helplessness. But the plea clawed at something deep inside him, something he thought long dead. He reached for the heavy bolt, sliding it back. The door groaned as he pulled it inward, almost ripped from his grasp by the gale. There, framed by the storm, stood a drenched figure, barely recognizable as human. Mud streaked her torn dress. Her hair hung in sodden clumps, plastered to a pale, frightened face. She clutched a threadbare shawl to her shoulders, trembling violently. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Just for the night. The storm." Garrett stared at her, young barely in her 20s, her wide eyes held a spark of resilience despite her desperation. "The barn," he said gruffly. "It's dry enough. There are blankets." She nodded, relief softening her features as she stepped into the cabin's threshold, dripping water onto the wooden floor. Garrett grabbed his oilskin coat and a lantern. "Come on." Together, they braved the storm toward the barn. The barn smelled of hay, damp wood, and the faint, sweet musk of horses. Though the storm raged beyond its walls, the space felt almost peaceful, like a fragile bubble of calm. Garrett set the lantern on a wooden crate, its warm glow pushing back the darkness in hesitant circles. "This stall's clean enough," he said, his voice low, as if unwilling to disturb the quiet. "There's an old horse blanket in that chest. I'll bring another from the house." The young woman nodded, clutching her shawl tighter. Mud flaked from her hem as she stepped cautiously over the threshold of the stall. She moved with an odd mixture of elegance and exhaustion, as though she were accustomed to gentler surroundings. "Thank you," she murmured, barely above the sound of the rain drumming on the roof. "Truly," Garrett grunted. Words didn't come easily anymore. I'll fetch you food too, stew and bread. Her wide eyes flicked toward him in surprise, but she said nothing more. It only sank to the straw-covered floor as though her legs might give out at any moment, an unwelcome companion memory back in the cabin. Garrett ladled venison stew into a tin bowl, his hands working mechanically, but his mind wasn't still. She had given no name, no explanation. He told himself it didn't matter. It was a stranger, she'd be gone come morning. And yet, in her trembling figure and hollow eyes, he'd glimpsed something achingly familiar. Martha had once shivered like that, wrapped in quilts as fever consumed her. He shook the memory away. The barn again. When he returned, she was huddled. Under the horse blanket, soaked hair clinging to her face. She looked up at him, startled at first, then relieved. Here. He handed her the bowl and a tin cup of water. She accepted them with trembling hands. This is more than I could have hoped for? Her voice was stronger now, but still frayed at the edges. You're very kind, Mr. Weston. Garrett Weston. Cora, she said softly. Just Cora. A single name. He didn't press for more. Storm Dash bound the next morning. The storm had not relented. Sheets of rain still lashed the plains, the wind shrieking across the hills like a furious spirit. Garrett pulled on his coat and boots, heading out to check the cattle. When he entered the barn, Cora was awake. She'd hung her damp clothes over a beam in a futile attempt to dry them. The firelight from the lantern illuminated her face, pale, but cleaner now, with delicate features and large, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything. The storm's not letting up, Garrett said. His breath misted in the cold air. She offered a faint smile. It seems I've brought the weather with me.
Her voice held a wryness he hadn't expected, a quiet humor flickering beneath her fear. It surprised him and stirred something
unfamiliar. A fragile truce by midday, he'd brought her more food and a mug of coffee, black and bitter. She thanked him with a politeness that seemed practiced, almost too refined. Her fingers, though reddened by cold, were slender and smooth, not the hands of a woman accustomed to hard labor. Garrett noticed, but said nothing. The cabins. Hearth later, during a lull in the storm, he allowed her into the cabin to dry her clothes by the fire. She sat quietly on a low stool, his oversized shirt and trousers swallowing her frame. You'll have to stay until the storm breaks, he said, breaking the heavy silence. I'm grateful, Mr. Weston. Her voice was soft but steady. No small thing to offer shelter to a stranger. Garrett cleaned his rifle, sneaking glances at her. There was a grace to the way she turned her dress before the flames, her movements careful, deliberate. She spoke little, yet her silence didn't feel uncomfortable. Hints of a past life over the next 2 days. A fragile routine formed. Cora insisted on helping washing dishes, tidying the cabin, even gathering eggs from the stubborn hens. Initial fumbling gave way to quiet determination. Garrett found himself speaking more than he had in years. She asked about the ranch, the cattle, the harshness of life in Montana territory. He answered, his words halting at first, then flowing. Easier, as she listened with unfeigned interest. But she spoke little of herself. No family mentioned. No destination. Only vague references to seeking independence and making her own way. And once, as she reached for a kettle, her sleeve slipped, revealing faint bruises along her arm. She noticed his eyes and quickly tugged the sleeve back down. She began, but the words caught in her throat. Garrett didn't press. The storm finally broke on the 4th morning, leaving behind a world soaked and battered. Water pooled in every dip of the land, the creek behind Garrett's cabin swollen and fast. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap, heavy with the promise of early snow. Garrett stood on the porch, the rifle cradled lazily in his arms. From here he could see Cora kneeling in the small patch of garden Martha had once tended. She had coaxed green life back from what had been only weeds and stubborn clay soil. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek, her damp hair falling loose around her shoulders as she worked. He turned away quickly. Don't get used to this. She's not staying. The ride to Chinook, the nearest town. Chinook lay a hard day's ride. South, The supplies were running low: flour, coffee, ammunition. Garrett didn't like leaving Cora alone on the ranch, but there was no choice. She assured him she'd be fine. "I'll tend the fire and keep out of sight," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Weston." She always said thank you for everything. It unsettled him, the way she wore gratitude like armor. The ride into town was uneventful. Chinook was, as he remembered, muddy streets lined with weathered wooden buildings, the saloon buzzing even at midday. Garrett kept his errands quick, avoiding idle chatter. An overheard conversation, he was loading his purchases onto his mule when voices drew his attention. Two men stood near the saloon's hitching post, speaking to Sheriff Peterson. One was tall, broad-shouldered, with a long duster coat and a hat pulled low. The other was older, with sharp features and a restless air. Both carried the look of city men trying to wear the frontier like a costume, but their pistols were real enough. "Cornelius Prescott's daughter," the older man was saying. "She's out here, somewhere. He wants her back. Family matter." Sheriff scratched at his beard, uneasy. "A lot of folks pass through here, Mr. Vance. Hard to say if I've seen her." Vance Garrett committed the name to memory. "She's to be married," Vance continued, his voice tight. "Alliance for her father's business. She ran off like a spoiled child. Prescott won't tolerate her little rebellion." The younger Monshaw, from the sound of it, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe she doesn't want the marriage, sir." Vance's expression hardened. "Want has nothing to do with it. She belongs with her family. With her duty. Belongs duty." The words slammed into Garrett like a hammer blow. Cora. Prescott. The return ride the road back to the ranch felt longer. His thoughts churned with every hoofbeat. She hadn't told him her full name. Hadn't said she was in. Heiress, a railroad baron's daughter. Hadn't said men might come looking, but he'd seen her bruises. Heard the tremor in her voice when she spoke of independence. What kind of father sends armed men after his child? What kind of world treats a woman like property? By the time the cabin came into view, dusk was settling over the land in hues of gold and purple. A confession by firelight. Cora was at the garden still, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting with a smile that faltered when she saw the shadow in his eyes. "You're back. Early," she said softly. "We need to talk." His tone was gentler than he felt. Inside, the fire crackled as Cora sat at the edge of the table, hands clasped tightly. "My father sent men," Garrett said. "They're looking for you."
Right.
She closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders sagging. "I knew he would. I just hoped for more time. You're Cornelius Prescott's daughter." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she whispered. "Cora Prescott. He plans to marry me off to a man twice my age to solidify some business deal. I couldn't bear it, Garrett. I had to run." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, he saw tears spill down her cheeks. "I only wanted a chance to breathe. To be myself, not some bargaining chip." Garrett was silent for a long moment, his rough hands curled loosely on the table. Then he said, simply, "You don't have to explain." She looked at him, startled. "But you're safe here." A vow in the dark that night, Garrett sat long by the window, the rifle across his knees. The silence of the plains felt different, not empty, but watchful. She's brought life back to this place without even trying, and I'll be damned if I let them take her from it. Outside, the wind had stilled, but in Garrett's chest a storm had begun to rise. The days that followed carried a heavy stillness. The storm had passed, but Garrett's unease lingered like a coiled rattlesnake in the shadows. He watched the horizon constantly now, his rifle never far from reach. The plains felt different, quieter, expectant. Even the cattle seemed to sense something brewing. Cora tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, tending to chores with quiet determination. But Garrett noticed the way her eyes flicked toward the hills every so often, the way her hands tightened when a distant noise carried on the wind. They spoke little of what lay ahead. Neither needed to. The riders late one afternoon. Garrett was hauling a pail of water when he saw movement on the ridge. Two riders silhouetted against the fading sun, his gut clenched. They came at a steady pace, their figures growing clearer as they crossed the fields, Vance with his predatory posture, and Shaw, who looked younger, less certain. Garrett set the pail down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and stepped onto the porch. The rifle rested in his hands, not raised, but ready. Inside, Cora had seen them too. She stood near the window, her face pale, but her chin lifted with a quiet resolve. "Stay inside," Garrett said. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "This is my fight too." Their eyes met, a silent agreement passing between them. The confrontation, the rider stopped a few yards from the porch. Vance's sharp eyes swept over the ranch before fixing on Garrett. "Garrett Weston?" he called out. "That's me," Garrett replied, even-toned. "We're here for Cora Prescott. Her father sent us to bring her home." Garrett's grip tightened slightly on the rifle. "The lady doesn't wish to go." Vance's mouth twisted. "Her wishes don't matter. She's a daughter, not a free agent. Her place is with her family." Cora stepped out then, standing tall beside Garrett. Her voice was clear and unwavering. "You're wrong, Mr. Vance. I'm not a commodity to be traded. I choose to stay." Vance's eyes narrowed. "Miss Prescott, you don't understand now. You don't understand. I will not return."
Ow.
Shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Sir, maybe we should quiet, Shaw," Vance snapped. A tense silence for a moment. No one moved. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the soft rustle of wind through dry grass. Garrett raised the rifle slightly, his voice low and dangerous. "You should leave. You're not welcome here." Vance's jaw tightened. "You'll regret this, Weston, maybe," Garrett said. "But not today." The withdrawal stared hard at Garrett, then at Cora. Fury danced in his eyes, but he was no fool. 2 against 2 was not odds he liked, not with Garrett's rifle steady in. His hands, finally, he tugged on his reins. "Let's go, Shaw." Shaw glanced back once, almost apologetically, before following, as their figures disappeared into the dusky horizon. A heavy silence settled over the ranch. Garrett exhaled slowly, the tension draining from his shoulders. He leaned the rifle against the cabin wall and turned to Cora. She was trembling not from fear, but from relief. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, You stood up for me." "We stood up for each other," Garrett said quietly. A fire rekindled that night. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Cora spoke more freely of her past, the gilded cage of wealth, the expectations of obedience, the loneliness of a life lived. For others, Garrett listened, his heart heavy with a quiet protectiveness he hadn't felt in years. "You deserve more," he said at last. Cora met his gaze, her voice soft. "So do you," and for the first time in a long while, Garrett Weston allowed himself to believe it. The snow came early that year, blanketing the Montana plains in a hush that softened even the harshest edges of the land. For the first time in 7 years, Garrett Weston's cabin felt like more than just a shelter. It felt like a home. Cora stayed. There was no formal discussion, no dramatic decision. She simply remained, moving through the cabin with quiet purpose, as though she had always belonged there. A new rhythm, the days settled into a rhythm neither had expected. Garrett taught her to tend the cattle, to chop kindling without splitting her knuckles, to ride the sturdy mare that had once belonged to Martha Docora, in turn, brought life back into the lonely house. She scrubbed the floors until the old wood gleamed, aired out the thick quilts, and coaxed herbs to grow in Martha's long-neglected garden. She found Garrett's small shelf of books, Shakespeare, Keats, and a worn history of the territories and read aloud in the evenings, her voice weaving warmth into the long winter nights. Garrett, listening from his chair, found the sound oddly comforting. Once he would have said he didn't need such things. Now, he couldn't imagine the silence returning. Wounds seen and unseeners. Spring teased the land with longer days and softer winds. Cora grew stronger. The haunted look in her eyes faded, replaced by a quiet determination. She spoke often of her dreams, not of ballrooms or finery, but of building something meaningful with her inheritance. Perhaps a school, or a hospital for the settlers and native families struggling in the territories. Garrett listened, quiet pride swelling in his chest. "You want to make a difference?" he said one evening as they watched the sun sink behind the Bear Paw Mountains. Want to live for more than just myself? Cora replied. I want to do it on my own terms. Garrett nodded. Then you will. She smiled at him softly, gratefully, and for a moment, he felt the years of loss and loneliness fall away. The ghosts that remain. One afternoon, Garrett took her up the small rise behind the cabin. 2 weathered wooden crosses stood there, surrounded by wildflowers Cora had planted weeks earlier. Martha, he said, his voice low, and Samuel, my family. Cora's hand brushed his arm gently. She didn't offer words of comfort, just quiet understanding. And somehow that was enough. The railroads reached, though no more men came. Garrett knew Cornelius Prescott's influence stretched far. But out here, beyond rail lines and telegraph wires, they felt a rare kind of freedom. One evening, Cora spoke. Of her father's power, he'll send others, she said. Then let him, Garrett replied, his voice like steady stone. I won't let anyone take you from here, not while I draw breath. A love like spring, it was not a love born of fiery passion, but of shared silences, of hands brushing together over a worn table, of laughter blooming where there had once been only grief. Garrett realized it slowly how he'd begun to measure his days not in chores, but in moments spent with her. The way her smile made the cabin seem warmer, how her determination reminded him of the strength Martha once carried. And one evening, as she read Keats by the fire, he simply reached out, taking her slender hand in his calloused one. She looked up, startled at first, then smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that said she understood. What is it, Garrett? She asked gently. Nothing, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Just stay a while longer. Her fingers tightened around his. As long as you'll have me. The enduring plains, the future was uncertain. Maybe Prescott would send more men. Maybe the world would come knocking. But they would face it together, to souls who had found refuge not in walls or wealth, but in each other. And for the first time in years, Garrett Weston felt the silence of the plains not as a wait, but as a promise. Closing scene. The camera lingers on the cabin as spring flowers bloom around it, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Garrett and Cora stand side by side in the garden, their hands brushing together as they work. The mountains rise in the distance, bathed in golden light. The world beyond might still come for them. But for now, in this corner of the Montana plains, they had found something stronger than fear, hope.